gamers, Powered Heal here, and today we're going to talk about why HoTs suck. The idea for this video came from last video. Last video was a video where we went over a bunch of Druid specs, and we kind of showed you the specs and talked about how good I thought they were. And the lens for that video was definitely viewing Druid through a supportive role, and that's still what I think it should be played as. And I think a lot of people agreed, but I got some feedback that that viewpoint was kind of outdated and that, in 2019 that would have been correct, but we're not in 2019 anymore. And the buff cap is now removed. So, that makes Druid kind of like a fully fledged and fully viable healer, right? And I just wholly disagree there. So I wanted to make a video talking about why. And I think that the main reason for that is that HoTs suck. And we're going to get into that in a second. But first of all, I just wanted to address the buff cap removal claim because the buff cap is removed in this current version. However, there's a couple things I wanted to mention about this. So first of all, in 2019, buff cap was really only a concern in a guild that was pretty min-maxing. I mean, it was a concern in my guild, and my guild was really min-maxing. I know there were a lot of guilds below us that didn't really have any issues with this, right? They just weren't using like anywhere close to the max number of consumes. And pugs, it's not really going to be an issue in most of the time, right? So, people were still using HoTs back in 2019, and there were still druids that were playing full-on Moonglow, and, and if anything, those druids I feel like were probably in more of a position to parse and do stuff like that than druids that were in top guilds, because typically you don't really want to be in like a top guild if you're trying to parse and really flex in the meteors, right? It's more beneficial to be in a guild that's not necessarily like super bad, but is not the greatest, right? You need stuff to heal, essentially, right? So this whole thing about like if you remove the buff cap, druids are going to dominate. It's like they already had a chance to show this in 2019, and then I played Season of Mastery, and the buff cap was removed in that, and druids were certainly not a dominant force in Season of Mastery by any stretch of the imagination. They were a utility class like they've always been, right? And not having world buffs I don't really think changes that too much, especially because none of the classes had world buffs, right? So it's not like they were playing on an uneven playing field. But yeah, I just wanted to mention those 2 points before we kind of got into the whole idea of HoTs and why they suck. And for this video, I normally don't necessarily always log on a character that's appropriate, to the topic I'm talking about, because a lot of times it's unnecessary. But in this case, I figured I'd just log on one of the druids I have. This guy is the guy that I played in Psalm, and this is pretty geared druid, and realistically, this is about as geared as you're going to get outside of, like, Nax, I would say. Like, you can get items from AQ 40 that are going to be better than this, right? There may be some AQ 20 stuff that I don't quite have or whatever on this character. This was not like a main, and I think I had basically quit around the time AQ was coming out. But realistically, the gear doesn't get that much better than this for a majority of the game. And part of that is because you're not going to really have access, in my opinion, to a ton of the good gear to begin with, right? So even the good items from AQ, like the hats and the chests from, I think, the bug trio and stuff like that, you may not necessarily have access to that as a resto druid. So this is a pretty good example of a gear druid, and anything that you're going to be playing now in 2020 anniversary is going to be less geared than this for quite a while, at least, right? At least until after a few Blackwing layer clears or whatever, which is probably going to be at least 5 to 8 weeks out, I would say. Not necessarily the instance, but like you getting geared. We got the Rejuve gem. The only thing I don't have is I don't have my DM trinket for some reason. But other than that, this is pretty decent gear. I think actually I'll put this on because this isn't my Nixia Scale Cloak. Okay, yes. Now we have a little bit more healing. And I'm just going to use this to demonstrate some things with the HoTs and stuff like that. But yeah, so before we actually get into showing HoTs, I want to talk about things kind of like from first principles and why I think HoTs are bad in a more just general sense, right? So and this pertains to Classic. We're going to talk a little bit at the end of the video, comparisons of Classic to other versions of the game, but for now we're just going to talk about Classic. And I think the first reason why HoTs are pretty bad in this version is because the damage that's incoming is highly inconsistent, and most of the time it's there's just not a lot of damage coming out, period. So you have 40 players in a Classic raid, right? And that means that each player's percentage contribution to the damage and healing is obviously less than it would be in like a 20-man, 25-man, like TBC, etc. So what tends to happen is that it's just easier and safer for guilds to run extra healers, right? Because you don't really gain quite as much from adding another DPS, especially if it's not a warrior, right? So if you're making like a pug run, or you just have like a normal kind of like mid guild or whatever, if you're not adding a warrior in like for the 39th or the 40th spot or whatever, you kind of almost might as well take an extra healer unless you're already at like 14 healers or something like that, right? Like personally, if I had the option to take like another healer versus like a hunter or something like that, I'd pretty much always take the other healer if I want the run to be smooth, right? So what this basically means is that you're starting out with a lack of damage just in general that kind of goes out in terms of like raid damage and overall damage that the boss and the trash are doing to you for the most part. And then you have a surplus of healing. So you can kind of see where the problem is already, right? And, when we look at what HoTs do, they heal over time, right? So they don't heal instantly. They don't even heal quickly. They heal over time, and their value is completely dependent in most cases on getting most of the ticks of the HoT, right? And this is incredibly hard to do, even in, I would say, kind of like upper mid-tier guilds, or like even mid-tier guilds, really. It's hard to get like really, really good value out of HoTs. And if you're playing in like a top-end guild, good luck getting basically any value out of HoTs outside of like very niche situations, right? Because number one, people aren't taking as much unnecessary damage. And this even kind of extends to the mid-tier guilds because the game is just an easy game, right? So people are pretty good at like avoiding the fire. They're not standing in cleave as much, right? So they're just really not taking a lot of damage, and there's really not a lot to heal. So it's really difficult to get your HoTs to do any significant healing in that environment. Other versions of the game, in fact, I would say that this contributed to how other versions of the game were kind of built from a healing perspective. Because when they decided in TBC and beyond, they kind of wanted Restoration Druid to be a real healer, I think one of the levers that they pulled to be able to, to do that and make that possible is they added a lot more raid damage to fights, right? Just a lot more, and some of it would be like ticking damage, essentially, right? Just damage that's unavoidable, you can't really do anything about, and, it just really helps to have somebody in the raid that can put a heal over time on a bunch of people and basically just counteract that damage that's going out. Right now, I don't even necessarily think that a druid is the best class to counteract stuff like that in every case, right? And we can talk about that at the end of the video. But at least the idea is that they were kind of designing fights where all classes had a use case, or not necessarily on a fight-by-fight basis, but on a raid basis, right? So all you need sometimes is like 3 or 4 encounters where it's nice to have HoTs, and all of a sudden like a restoration druid is pretty useful to have in your raid, right? And it kind of secures that spot. That's kind of the other problem with Classic, is that, and really until you get to Nax, and even in Nax to some degree, the boss encounters, I feel like, take a step back to the trash, and you really don't get any of those crazy boss encounters that like require lots of healing, or HoTs in particular, or any type of heals over time, outside of a few notable exceptions like stuff like Monexia, right? But other than that, just not really the case. So I think that the first problem really is just the inconsistent damage that goes out from the mobs, and then tagged along with that, the surplus of heals you tend to have in the game. And then I want to talk about how classes are incentivized to play, right? So there's kind of two facets to this. And this is like the second problem with why HoTs are bad, right? So the first facet I would say is kind of relates to the overhealing situation above, right? Because there's so many healers typically in a raid, most of the time what you're doing is you're trying to prevent people from dying at all, right? And this is especially the case in a world buff meta like in 2024, where we have world buffs available, and when somebody dies, they're going to have a very poor experience playing out the rest of the raid, right? So you're incentivized to kind of use your fastest, quickest, most life-saving heals possible to keep people alive. And when everybody has that mentality and everybody's doing that, it's even more difficult for these HoTs to work than they would in like a normal situation, right? Where maybe things were like a bit more relaxed or stuff like that. And I wanted to go one step further there. The culture of how you're kind of judged in raid tends to be more about how quickly you progress through the raid. Like if I tell you that there's a pug that clears MC in 45 minutes and there's another one that clears it in an hour and a half, most of you would want to be in the 45-minute pug, right? And that in itself incentivizes the healing style that we're talking about here, right? Because it's always go, 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 right? And when you're going, you want people to be full health. So there's not really this thing where it's like, oh, we're going to sit in between each pull. We're kind of going to lackadaisically recover our mana, recover our health. And then everybody's going to be full going into the next pull. It's like, no, not everybody's going to be full going into the next pull unless the healers make them full, right? And how it works is in most cases you have enough surplus healing where that's still the case, even if you're running relatively quickly, right? So yeah, it's just like healers are incentivized to essentially sort of snipe by the nature of the content and by the nature of how performance is judged in the game itself. Okay. So kind of two things working against you here. And not only that, but I would even argue it goes one step further. So there's one extra bit to that where the classes themselves have certain incentives, right? So for example, Shaman wants to be casting Chain Heal as much as possible because it's basically their most efficient heal. Like, if they can get away with it, they just want to be casting this 100% of the time, all the time. What does that mean? Well, lots of people who aren't, like, directly being targeted by heals are getting healed because there's 2 bounces for each Chain Heal, and you normally have a minimum of 6 Shamans in the raid. Now, if you go over to the Alliance side, right, and this is even to a degree on the Horde side, depending on how your group is set up, right, you have Priests, where priests want to be using Prayer of Healing when possible because Prayer of Healing is their most kind of like mana efficient healing back point of damage per mana point spell or whatever, right? You'd say, assuming they get good value out of it, right? And so they want to be using that as much as possible. And that means it's going to be even harder for your HoTs to find targets, right? So you have the priests on the Alliance side, you have priests and shaman on the Horde side that are kind of competing, right? And then paladins don't really have much AoE heal, but paladins are essentially a mana battery, right? And paladins can basically cast Flash of Light to infinity, especially in a world buff meta. So realistically, there's not a reason for people to really hoard that mana on a paladin. So they're not going to be like thinking like, oh, I'm just going to let this guy's HoT heal up this warlock. You know what I mean? Because it's like, well, what if a Lava Surger comes along or something like that, right? And just taps this guy, or he pulls threat on a mob right off the rip. And this thing walks over to him, and he could have survived if he was at full health. So even a class like a Paladin that has no AoE is still incentivized to basically spam heals on anything that they see that can move, because they just have infinite mana. So yeah, druids they're not helped by number one, the inconsistent damage and the surplus of healing, and then number two, just kind of like how the game is played. Okay. So that's kind of like two things. And then, so my thoughts on like HoTs in general will be kind of like the third thing, right? I think that generally, I wanted to talk about one more thing first, right? And then we'll get into like the more general cases. So the final thing that I wanted to kind of talk about with HoTs and why they're bad is let's look at the use cases where they would be good, right? Because it's important to do that because you need to be fair here, right? And what people are going to say immediately is well, yeah, it maybe doesn't make sense to be rejuvenating and regrowthing random raid members in Classic for the most part because, not a lot of consistent damage goes out on those players. So if a mage takes damage, you don't really want to regrowth them because realistically, once you cast the regrowth and you heal them to basically full from either just the base regrowth or the first couple ticks of the hot portion, then all the rest of that is going to be wasted because they're not taking consistent damage. But you could cast those spells on a tank, right? And a tank is constantly taking damage. So if a tank is constantly taking damage, that means your heals are constantly going to be working and things are going to be fantastic, right? And it's a good thought in theory, and it can work maybe in some situations, especially in mid or mediocre guilds or in really bad pugs. But the reality of the situation is that, even when consistent damage exists, so does consistent healing. And typically that consistent healing is needed. So what do I mean by that, right? So tanks are going to be taking consistent damage, but, because they are tanks, by the very nature of the fact that they're tanks, they're going to be getting a lot of consistent heals, not only from people assigned from them, but most people in the raid at least know the main tank and the off tank, right? So even if, they're not assigned to that tank in particular, they're still going to be watching that tank's health, ideally, and most of them probably are, especially if they're trying to parse or snipe or anything like that, right? To make themselves look better, which most players are, to be honest, right? So there's going to be a ton of attention on the tank and the off tank, a ton of attention. And, on Horde side, maybe sometimes this isn't always the case as much because shamans tend to just chain heal whoever they want. And I think a lot of them don't necessarily realize that chain healing the tanks can be really good in most situations so long as they time their heals correctly and, there are people around the tank in a given scenario. But even so, I think on the Horde side, the tanks are still getting a lot of attention, right? And so with all that consistent healing, again, it's just going to... your HoTs aren't really going to be doing that much, right? Because when you watch a tank's health bar in a raid, okay, realistically, ask yourself this question, right? Even if you're the person who's really trying to defend HoTs, try and be honest with yourself and answer this, okay? How does a tank's health bar move? Is it really they're at 90% and then we go to 70 and then we tick back to 83 and then we go to 50 and then we go to 60? Or it's really more we're at 100%, we go to 70, we go instantly back to 100, we go to 50, we go to instantly back to 100, we go to 20, we instantly go back to 70, then a moment later we go back to 100, right? The healing on the tank is very spiky in any moderately good run where people aren't completely trolling, right? Because and it really needs to be like that because so it's not the consistent healing isn't needed, right? In most cases you want that. You want extra eyes in the tank. You want there to be some degree of overhealing on the tank. Now, not necessarily overhealing in the strict sense of you don't necessarily want to be wasting mana on a tank that's full, but you want to have people looking to be doing healing on him at all times and then canceling and stuff like that, right? So the tank is getting tons of attention. His health is just ping-ponging. The moment it goes below 100, it basically goes back to 100, right? And if your HOT is not ticking in that small fraction of time that he's below, below 100% or something like that, then it's doing nothing, right? However, I'll go one further, and people aren't going to like this, but this is just the reality. Even when your HOTs are doing healing on a tank, okay, most of the time, that healing is wasted, and I would consider that the overheal. So even when you're not doing technical overhealing with the HOTs, right, I think that realistically speaking, you are technically contributing more overhealing, quote, there. Because what your HOTs are doing is they're making the heals that are coming into the tank, they're making those overheals, right? And the problem is that there's never going to be a situation outside of a super organized run, which we're not really talking about here, right? Where there's going to be enough communication in the run where we're like playing around somebody's HoTs to that degree, right? Like realistically, what's going to happen is the tank is just going to be spammed, right? Because in most cases, you have the mana to do that to some degree. You can at least cancel cast on him, right? And then let your cast go off. So the tank is going to get tons of incoming heals always, right? Nothing is going to change that. The fact that you have HoTs in the tank shouldn't change that from a philosophical perspective, because you having HoTs on the tank shouldn't take more people's eyes off the tank, because burst damage is still insane in this game, and HoTs are not going to save you from Nefarian breathing you and then getting a thrash on you where he crushes for like 2 point some K and then crits for like 2K or whatever and just one-shots your tank after like a 5K breath. HoTs are not going to save you from that. I mean, they could theoretically, but they're not like a high... it's not a high likelihood that they will. They may not even tick at all during the burst window, because some of these burst windows on heavy incoming damage are literally like 1 second or something like that. Like a lot of the times when people die in my guild, it's like literally, I mean, sometimes there's trolling going on, people, space out or forget, stuff like that, and people go without heals for like 2-3 seconds. But sometimes it is like literally like 1 second. You know what I mean? Where somebody just gets blown up. And unless the HoTs are ticking at the perfect moments, like in the milliseconds in between, they're not going to do absolutely anything against damage like that. So you need people spamming these high priority tank targets regardless, right? So basically every time your HoT's ticking, you're basically making their healing do overhealing, because it's very rare that your HoTs are going to tick and then their heal is going to do like the perfect amount to heal them to full but not overcap them, or it's going to get them just under max or something like that, Like realistically, there's so many heals coming in that like your HoTs are causing some amount of overhealing of other people's heals, like full stop basically. And I think that's how you really have to think of even HoTs on the tank. You know what I mean? Now, obviously, if you're playing Swiftman spec or something, you're going to have a HoT on the tank regardless, but that's a little bit different because the use case for that HoT is to potentially turn it into an instant heal, right? So even if you're doing overhealing or whatever, it's kind of like worth it to have as a safety mechanism, right? But that's not really what we're talking about here, and that wasn't what I feel like the sentiment of the comments were when people were talking about Druid being like its own individual, completely actualized healer in this version of the game. It wasn't really talking about stuff like that. It was talking about you being able to kind of like hard carry the raid through the use of being able to use your HoTs. So not even hard carry, but be like a really big contributing force to the raid because of your HoTs. But it's just not really the case, right? Because like I said, they're not enough consistent damage to use them on raid members, right? Like raid healing, and there's not and using them on the tank is a waste most of the time, because most of the time they're not going to actually be the thing that saves the tank, and they're also essentially just creating other like overhealing for other healers, right? And they're doing overhealing themselves. So you kind of got like 3 problems there. Now obviously there's exceptions like Menexa and stuff like that where you don't have access maybe to direct healing the tank or something like that, and in those cases HoTs are great, right? So I always recommend having your HoTs on your bar and stuff like that. Like I'm not going to that degree. I have multiple versions of Renew on my Priest, right? But still, that doesn't make it good in most cases. And if something is not good and when I say most cases, it's like barely any cases where it's good, right? So if something is only good like 5 to 10% of the time, and that's the main feature of your class, then your class is just not going to be very good, right? And that's kind of like the reality. And Druids don't really have a way to compete with the healing classes that have like the faster putback heals, right? Like regrowth is pretty much their fastest thing there when you have like the 2 set and everything, and even that doesn't compete with something like Flash Heal, Lesser Healing Wave, or Flash of Light, and on top of that, it's way less mana efficient, right? Because you're just hemorrhaging mana efficiency on the back end, even if the front end does a decent bit of good. So yeah, it's just Druids are in a tough spot in that regard, right? Because the main thing that makes their class sort of like unique, their kind of like gimmick, is just not really that helpful for the raid in most cases, unless you're sure you can get full value out of it, which in most cases you just simply can't. So with that being said, I want to kind of talk about just HoTs a little bit in general, and we could talk about some scenarios like where they might be better or something like that, right? So there's kind of like two things that really come to mind here, right? So first of all, I think, and this is kind of like what started happening too, and like both of these things started happening in other expansions, right? Which is kind of what helped make Druid a better healer. So, well, there's actually three things I'll say. So I'm going to add something to this list. And the first thing is you can make HoTs that tick like a little bit faster or tick when damage comes in, which I feel like at that point is not really a HoT in the same sense. But is sort of fulfilling that role, and Druid, as the game progresses, gets a lot of spells that are closer to that. Obviously those are a lot better because they kind of guarantee the healing. It's almost like a pre-shield in a sense, except in a way it's even better than a pre-shield, because as long as it has a good duration in terms of staying on the target, right? Because the shield will fade after at least like 20 seconds or something like that, where some of these abilities will actually stay active like very, very long in other versions of the game. But there's really nothing like that in Classic, because HoTs are just, there's no smart aspect to HoTs in Classic. It's just you put them on the target, they tick at this interval, and if the target's full during that interval, they're completely wasted. If they weren't critical to healing the person during that interval, they're basically wasted, right? So, yeah, just there's no like smart aspect to them in this version of the game. And the other way, they can be good is if they're very overpowered, right? Which means that if they're very hyper mana efficient to the point where you don't need the full value of the HoT to get value out of it. Okay, and I think this is another thing that started happening kind of like later expansions and stuff like that, is you just didn't, and this is going to be combined with another thing, but realistically, like, you just kind of got more for getting like less ticks, and you were able to get more ticks because remember, more damage is coming out and there's less healers in the other versions of the game, right? So basically they need to be OP. They need to be like very mana efficient or whatever, right, for them to have a good use. And the third and final thing, and this kind of actually does apply in Classic a little bit sometimes, is when you not needing to care about mana, right? So this has kind of become more and more a thing as retail has kind of progressed as a game, is that if you notice in Classic, it's very much about managing your mana, right, throughout an instance. Like, you don't want to dump all your mana in one place. Like, sometimes you want to be using your slow, really efficient heals and stuff like that. This kind of goes out the window in retail, and the whole healing kit, they're just tailored more around pressing the right button at the right time for various situations and kind of setting up your healing. Right, and there being almost like a greater overall plan or design to how you're healing and the flow of your healing, as opposed to just like mana management, right? They've kind of very much gotten away from mana management, and I think the reason why they did that is because, generally speaking, especially like undisciplined players, I feel like they don't really like the concept of having to play around mana. It feels like unfun to them. They want to just be casting all the time. Like a warrior is using abilities and using auto attacks all the time, right? They don't want to be super restricted in terms of like using their mana. It just doesn't feel good to them. So I think that's why they kind of got away from that and changed how healing basically functions in later versions of the game. But in this version of the game, most of the time you are caring about mana almost all the time, right? So it doesn't really work in the Classic case. One thing I will say, though, is there are situations in this game where, you may not care about mana as much. So, for example, if you're in, like, a guild that's drinking to full after every pack or something like that, right? Now, Druid becomes a bit more viable, right? Because you only have to, it's like a sprint. Every pack is like a sprint. Like, the instance, you might think it's like a marathon, but if you're sprinting and then you're pausing to rest, right, it doesn't really function like a marathon because you can constantly just remax your mana at every point. So in those cases, if you're in a guild or a pug like that, Druid healing may not necessarily seem so bad because you can use a lot of these HoT spells, and then once your HoTs are out, you can cast over top of them with your normal heals, right? So you can actually get quite a bit of HPS doing that. It's just that you tend to not be able to sustain it very well, right? Because you're having to absorb the cost of having all these HoTs out, right? That's like a ton of overhead for you, while also casting your more efficient heals on group members. And then if you use something like Regrowth, that spell is just ridiculously mana hungry in general, and you go so fast using it. So you really need the encounter or the pack or whatever to be over like relatively quickly. And that's what I was getting at with the Regrowth build for the tech packs in Blackwing Lair, and why it matches up so well, is because in that particular use case, the tech packs are highly dangerous. They do a lot of spike damage, right? But they tend to die very quickly, and you tend to get at least a good bit of recovery during those packs, right? So it's not really so much of a big deal that you blow through a lot of your mana, because you can recover it back, and at least you're blowing through it, and you're kind of getting similar value out of what like a shaman or a priest would, like a shaman would do a chain heal, or a priest would do with flash heal. You know, you're literally saving people sometimes with this Regrowth spell in that case. So there definitely are situations where you don't really care about mana as much, and in those situations Druid does shine more than it would otherwise. But generally speaking, in Classic, you care about mana a lot. It's like the most coveted resource a healer could have, for sure, unless you're doing something like hyper abusive, like just flash spamming. But at that point, it's kind of like, why even play the game, right? Because the only difficult thing about this game, healing wise, in general, I would say, is managing the mana, right? And obviously, well, selecting the target obviously can be as well, and is very important, but the mana management is meant to be a central component, a very important part. And when you get away from that, then you're removing a lot of the skill ceiling for sure. So I'm going to do a couple other things to close the video. I want to show you what the heals look like, even in a Druid with this amount of gear. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Innervate, just because I feel like Innervate enables the HoTs to be used, right? So just to kind of show you what the HoTs look like, and again, I'll show you all my gear, right? So we got Tier 2, Jindu's Eye, which is pretty good. Tier 2, this is not like the best cloak or anything, but it's basically equivalent or very close to like Hide of the Wild or whatever. My hide, I think, is in the bank. Oh, this is it. Oh, no, that's Cloak of the Cosmos. I don't know. Storm Rage Chest, Storm Rage Bracers, so all Tier 2. The Tier 2 Glove, you would use the Tier 2 Gloves, but I just don't have them. Corehound Belt is actually really good. You would probably use it over the set, unless you wanted, like, the top, like, all the set pieces, right? You would use the Tier 2 boots as well. I just didn't have those. This ring combination, I'm going to make a whole video about this around when ZF comes out. It's like very strong. Rejuvenation gem, obviously very strong. We even have the Rejuvenation Idol, right? Now, to be clear, this looks a lot better than it is, because this just adds 50 to the heal overall, which is good. And I think it even adds it... Well, it doesn't really matter too much because the coefficient is already 80. But I don't even think this passes through the coefficient. I think it just adds it to the heal. But obviously this is split over the tick, so it's not like you're getting an additional 50 health per tick or anything like that. That'd be insane. And even my weapon is honestly pretty damn good. This is like a weapon from the Green Dragons, the world bosses, and it's pretty decent to have at this point, I would say. You can get more plus healing with the one-hand, off-hand combo, but the greater stat package on this is better, basically, outside of, like, rank 14 stuff. Pre-AQ40, at least. So, pretty damn good gear on this Druid, and this is a max rank rejuvenation, okay? So we're going to cast it, and you see it heals 392, and that's pretty good, right? But that, keep in mind, that is with Gift of Nature and Improved Rejuvenation, so you probably won't have this if you're playing Moonglow or whatever. Keep in mind, this is just the base value, but I just wanted to be fully transparent with everything here. So the Rejuve is, like, pretty decent, honestly, right? That's not bad, but remember, I have a lot of gear on this Druid, right? So, yeah. And, I mean, you could kind of get similar amounts of plus healing right now, but you'd be giving a lot of other stats up, right? So you'd just be going quicker in other ways. Let's cast a Regrowth. So let's do it. I'm going to actually just do it out of the spell book because I just want to make sure I have the best one bound. You can see this is 900 mana, by the way. 900 mana. Okay? Look at how it's destroying my mana bar when we cast it. Okay. So we'll cast one. Okay, so 218, 218, 218. So this one, in my opinion, like regrowth is very mid, because at least with rejuvenation, when it's ticking, it's doing a lot of healing. This is basically doing half the healing of rejuvenation, which means that you need the first part to do a lot, right? And the biggest problem with regrowth, and why I think it's such a bad spell in this version of the game, is because you almost never need both things to happen at the same time. Now, there's other versions of WoW where regrowth is an amazing spell, but that is mostly due to, first of all, just changes in terms of the tuning, but also, like I said, increased damage going out, right? And what that helps with is that helps you get full value on the first part of the spell, and you have a decent chance of still getting value on the second part of the spell, right? But in Classic, if you're casting Regrowth on a raid member that's taken chunk damage, the notion that you're going to get anywhere close to the full value on the secondary part, the 21-second part, is just, it's not, you're not going to get, like, anywhere close to that value, right? And then the problem is, like, so in that case, you're using it for the primary part, right? So you're kind of getting the effect you want, but you're paying for the tail effect still, and you're not really getting any benefit from it. But let's talk about if you're putting on the tank, right? So now you're kind of getting the heal over time part, right? But you're not getting the initial part, really, because now if you want to have regrowth ticking all the time, you have to wait for an opportunity for the tank to be low enough and the tank to not, be just getting spam healed back to 100%, where you can land your growth and make sure the first part gets value, okay? And then if you can do that, then the second part obviously has a greater chance of getting value on the tank than it does on, some other random raid member, right? But remember, you now had to sacrifice uptime because you're waiting for the perfect time to, like, apply it. And in most cases, what happens is it just gets thrown on the tank like it's a rejuvenation, right? And when you do that, you lose all of the first part of the efficiency, right? Normally, people just cast this on the tank to just get it up, right? But if you do that, you throw out the entire first part of the heal. So in most cases, like 90% of the time, you basically are throwing out one portion or throwing out the other portion, right? Whereas at least if you're using Rejuve, right, most likely you have a use case in mind where you're probably going to at least have a chance to get close to full value. You probably won't, right? But you're going to have at least a chance. Whereas, like, it's almost impossible to find that situation with regrowth, right? And keep in mind, even when those regrowth ticks do come in on something like a tank, right, it's only ticking for 200. So is that really going to be the difference maker in most cases? If you add the regrowth tick with the rejuve tick, that's fairly substantial. But keep in mind, that's a max rank regrowth with a lot of plus healing on the druid, and a max rank rejuve with a lot of plus healing on the druid. And you would have to be rolling that all the time, or get insanely lucky and have it rolling when the perfect storm scenario comes in, right? That would make it so that those like hot ticks are actually what saves the tank in those cases, right? It's just not likely. It's not efficient. It's not a great way to spend your mana. And the final thing I want to talk about is Innervate, right? Because I think a lot of the time, the reason why druids feel comfortable using HoTs is because they just innervate themselves, right? So they don't even notice really how much mana they're burning through, because when they get low, they just drop an innervate on themselves. And it's like, well, it doesn't matter that, my spells cost a lot, and it costs a lot to keep these HoTs rolling or whatever, because I can just innervate myself, and then I'm, like, back to full mana, right? And it's like, well, but you could have innervated anybody else in the raid, right? And the guy I was talking to in the comment section, he was like, oh, well, it only, or priests were only the top healers back in 2019 and back in OG Classic is because there was a buff cap and everybody used to innervate the priest. You know what I mean? Because the druids couldn't use their HoTs. So obviously the priest was going to have an advantage. But now you would just innervate yourself, and you can outcompete the priest. And why should the priest get the innervate over the druid? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And the problem with that is that the priest is just doing more efficient healing, right? In 90% of cases, which is why the priest should get the innervate. Also, it's not even necessarily about doing more efficient healing, but the priest can just do way more than your class can, right? Because they dispel, they have shields, which can prevent damage, super useful. They have a hot of their own, which is it base better than rejuvenation's base, right? And they have a flash heal for emergencies, and they have a normal standard heal that functions very similarly to healing touch. So basically, priest is kind of like the class that has an answer to every problem. So obviously, innervating the class that has an answer to potentially every problem is better than innervating the class that has like very constrained effectiveness, right? Like, druids are only effective when their HoTs can get good value. When is that? Not very often, right? Priest is effective in virtually every scenario in the game. And that's what makes it such a crazy class, even if it doesn't have, like, the raw max HPS threshold of maybe, like, a fully out-geared shaman spamming chain heal, right? It's the fact that it can handle any situation and perform well in any situation, right? So yeah, really, realistically, there's no reason to give your innervate to yourself over the priest, because it's just going to always have better use on the priest, unless the druid player is just better, obviously, right? Like, if you are the best player in your guild and you're the best player in your guild by a mile, right, and your other healers are like really bad, then sure, innervate yourself. But you really shouldn't be innervating yourself in any case. You should be innervating a priest, a shaman, or whatever. I can make a whole video on innervate, because there's a lot of misconceptions with innervate, I feel like. But I just wanted to talk about it here because I feel like innervate is what allows people to think that the hot build is like super good, because they're innervating themselves and they're not really realizing how inefficient they're being, right? Because they always have mana still. And it feels like everything's going good from their perspective, but realistically, you could have gave a priest that whole mana bar back, and they would just be way more efficient, either efficient or more useful with the mana, right? They can do more with it, essentially, given the shields, given the flash shields, given the dispels, etc., right? They can save more people than you can, most of the time, and that is just like the reality of the situation. So thank you for coming to my TED Talk. That is why HoTs are bad in my opinion. And I'll close with like one more point, I guess, to wrap things up, is that realistically, remember how I talked about the conditions that would be required for HoTs to be good? Basically them being like overpowered, right, at base, or you not needing to care about mana. Basically, outside of those conditions, it's always better to just put health back rather than have a hot. Almost in almost every situation in this game, there's very few bosses. Like I think Anubarak, the one from Trial of the Grand Crusader, that's one of the only ones where like you want to keep people's health low, because the amount of damage the debuff does, it does like more damage when they're at higher health. So if you can keep people at like 30% and you can keep them there with HoTs, it's a lot better than bringing them to full health, and the thing is just going to rot a higher percentage of their health in that case, right? So there's very few cases where that's actually the case in the history of WoW, and there's no case like that in Classic WoW, right? You pretty much... And so unless, like, the cost you're paying to fully heal somebody is, like, way more than the hot, you would always rather them be healed sooner than later, right? You'd always rather them be healed quicker than having to sit the full duration of a heal over time, because anything can happen to them during that duration, and it's just much safer in general if they're healed, right? So yeah, really, just in order for HoTs to be useful, they have to be more efficient in some way, or you have to just not care about mana, and they have to be an extra thing that gets added on top, right? That can, it's just like an extra layer of protection, essentially, right? That, you don't really care about providing because it's not, even though it's costing you mana, you don't care about the resource in that case. But it's just almost never going to be the case that you don't care about mana in Classic WoW. So yeah, I repeated myself a little bit there at the end, but I think you guys get the point, and I kind of wanted to stress it and emphasize it, right? So thank you guys for watching the video. If you found this helpful, like, comment, and subscribe. It helps out a lot. And thank you guys for watching, and see you guys next time.